Pleasure to be here. You did a very great introduction about Houston Stronger themselves, and we're pleased to be here to talk more about what we're working on. You mentioned, of course, that we have put together a regional flood infrastructure program made up of many components across our 8-county region. And it totals, it's creeping up above $70 billion now. I just have to update that information in a little while on our screens. But the real reason for us to be here today is to talk about a portion of the overall plan having to do with the Buffalo Bayou watershed, which encompasses areas from Cypress Creek in the northwest, heading down into what is called upper Addicks, then into the Addicks and Barker reservoirs, and then downstream along Buffalo Bayou. And the reason we're focusing on that is because a year ago, in October 2020, after Harvey, the U.S. Corps of Engineers did a study of that area because of the impacts that were created because of Hurricane Harvey. As a result, there was some components that people were not pleased with, and that is what we've been working on since, is to try to bring together groups that can respond to the Corps with some additional suggestions for flood mitigation in this area. So with that, I'm turning it over to Auggie to begin our presentation.
Great. If you can go to the next slide. Thank you, Chris. And it's been a real just kind of whirlwind. I think when Christina and I started this along with Joby Allen, we originally thought that we just needed to get some flood funding and we would be in and out of this in a few years. It's going to take a little while longer, and luckily we've been the recipients of some good planning. And if you look at Houston has always known that it has flooding issues. And it's always had plans. It just hasn't always finished those plans. And so that's one of the reasons that Houston Stronger will be here a while. On the screen, you'll see a plan completed in 1940 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And of course, this plan was in response to floods in the 1920s and 1930s. 15 inches of water, 15 inches in 24 hours, basically inundated all of downtown Houston. And that led to the development of this plan, the creation of the Harris County Flood Control District, and the creation of Addicks and Barker Reservoir. Unfortunately, the other components that you see on this map were not completed, including a Cypress Creek levee that would have held water back and kept it off of the Katy Prairie from flowing into Addicks and Barker Reservoir. And a south canal was contemplated but not constructed, and that would have taken water safely out of Buffalo Bayou and to the bay. That was never constructed. There was a small reservoir on White Oak Bayou, and that would have taken water all the way across the north side of town to what's now Lake Houston and into the San Jacinto River, and that also was not constructed. So fast forward, and if you go to the next slide, you can see that while Addicks and Barker were able to deal with a lot of storms for decades, they ultimately proved insufficient to handle Houston's flooding issues. And we first felt this in the Memorial Day flood in 2015, and then in the Tax Day flood. But nothing really got the public, really the world's attention as much as Hurricane Harvey. And this is for years, the West Houston Association and a number of engineering organizations had let the county know that the amount of funding for flood control was insufficient. And it was interesting because if you look at Tropical Storm Allison, at that point, the Harris County dedicated 8 cents of every dollar to flood control. By the time of Hurricane Harvey, the Harris County provided less than 2.8 cents of every dollar in tax revenue to flood control. So really, despite the warnings and the storms that we had, infrastructure development was not keeping up with the need for across the county and across the region. If you go to the next slide, you can see, just how insufficient the infrastructure that we had was, and how big of an issue flooding became. So if you look at, you can see the 2015 and 16 events, they were big events. They were 500-year storm events, and they were still nothing compared to Hurricane Harvey. If you go to the next slide. Now, if we would have had that 1940 plan, what would flooding look like? That was the real challenge for Houston Stronger, is we really believe that if we would have stuck to that 1940 plan and completed it, that the significant flood inundation and loss of life and property damage that we suffered would have been significantly less. So if you go on to the next slide. And we weren't, there were a number of organizations who believe this, and you can see them on this page. And I'll turn it back over to Chris to talk a little bit about the formation of Houston Stronger and why we exist.
Yeah. Again, this group really came together after Hurricane Harvey. And as Auggie just mentioned, because of the decline in the property tax revenues that the flood control district had been receiving were just really insufficient for a community of our size, and with the type of ongoing flooding problems that we experienced. And that's when we really just all said we need to do something more to keep a focus on this problem and to bring this constantly up to the attention of our elected officials and other agencies that are involved with this, to again keep moving forward with implementing a number of plans that have been created throughout the region and are just waiting for funding to get implemented. And so that's what we decided to do, is we needed to put a heavier emphasis on working through this tremendous backlog of projects that need to get done in order to help reduce the potential for the flooding in this region. And we're very proud of the number of different types of organizations that are members and are willing to help us work on this issue.
So there was a question that in the Q&A that asked,
okay,
why did the county not pursue funding to implement these projects? And the simplest answer is this was a core project. All of these projects were proposed and originally funded by the Corps, and the Corps made the calculation that it could wait. It didn't even purchase all of the land on the back of Addicks and Barker that it anticipated it would need in order to provide enough land to capture the probable maximum precipitation event on government-owned land. So really, there was a little bit of a tug of war between who was going to be responsible for these projects, and it was really inertia. And the idea that maybe it's the Corps who's supposed to do it, or maybe it's the county who's supposed to do it, or maybe the city of Houston will come in and build these projects. And because somebody else could do it, it never happened.
Auggie, I think the other thing that bears mentioning here is that, remember, we're talking about a 1940s time frame. And there was a little event called World War II that got the federal government distracted. And at that time, they probably decided that it was more important to build tanks and bombers than it was to dig a hole.
Well, they came back from World War II, and they actually built Addicks and Barker after World War II. So I won't let them off the hook with World War II. I will say that, during the Eisenhower administration, they tried to unwind a lot of federal debt. So that's one of the reasons that federal projects didn't fall out as quickly. And then with the passage of the Environmental Protection Act, and then the shift in the Reagan administration and reducing federal funds for projects under WRDA, that also made a significant contribution. So I think, with the cumulative effect of the Environmental Protection Act, Clean Water Act, Reagan administration shift away from federal funding for federal projects all made a huge impact on why these projects weren't built. So yes, I agree. But anyway, I wrote an extremely interesting paper on that shift on federal funding. So if anyone wants to read that, I'll provide that in the notes afterwards. But so Chris, back over to you and sort of what we were trying to do.
So this is a rendering, a exhibit of what we would call our regional plan. As I mentioned earlier, it takes in our 8-county region. We've identified some, really large projects throughout the area. Of course, one of the ones also being proposed and on its way to Congress is the Coastal Spine project, or Ike Dike. So this number has changed recently. I think it went up to like $28.7 billion now for this proposed project. And that would be its total cost. And it hasn't been broken out yet as to what would be supported by the federal government if approved, what amount that would be versus what would need to be raised by the local community. And then the areas that we're talking about today in the Buffalo Bayou Community Plan are over here with the labels A, and A1, 2, and 3, 4. This is the area that we're talking about today, some of the concepts that we're pursuing in this area. So this is the regional plan that we pulled together in 2018, and are trying to keep it updated as best we can in terms of as we know what the cost of these projects are over time, that we'll continue to update this slide. Would you like me to move on now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Something will not let my. There we go. Sorry about that.
And just to let you all know, I mean, we came in with the idea that we needed to bring in about $57 billion, and we still have a lot of work to go. But I will point out that one of the first things we worked on was federal legislation, and including funding in the 2018 Bipartisan Budget Act. There was $89.4 billion of resiliency funding in there, but we had to split that with Puerto Rico, Florida, California, and I think 14 other jurisdictions. So really about 10 billion of that has come to Texas for various things, but approximately, I think if you split it up, about 8 billion has come for what you would be able to consider flood control related projects, including funding from the General Land Office. That's the biggest chunk, but a lot of it's also, or that's under local control. A huge amount has gone to the Corps, and they're using that to pursue a variety of projects, including the Ike Dike and other flood-related projects. Harris County, we advocated for the 2018 flood bond, which was the most successful bond proposition in the history of Harris County. It was. I think there are 188 projects that are currently being pursued by the Flood Control District, which is pretty astounding. And a lot of those projects are either under construction or soon to be let. At the state level, back in 2019, we advocated for Senate Bills 7 and 8, resulting in $1.7 billion in flood infrastructure. For the Flood Infrastructure Fund. And then also, and when we were advocating for this, I didn't really think that we'd be able to get this far ahead on regional flood planning and a state flood plan. And I will say that, both on Senate Bills 7 and 8, now Speaker Dade Phelan and Brandon Creighton did an amazing job of advocating for those projects. And I'll give, Cole Korst and some of our other local representatives a huge amount of credit for working on that too. Houston Stronger and other organizations tried to get some of the American Rescue Plan Act funds. There were 16 billion of those at the state level. We tried to get 500 million for the flood infrastructure fund, and it doesn't look like we succeeded in that, but that's, we're hopeful that there's an infrastructure bill coming out soon, and we'll have some more opportunities to bring flood and resiliency dollars to projects, not just in Houston, but across Texas. The flood infrastructure fund has really been used across Texas. So has the state action plan related to that bipartisan budget act. So really, Texas has benefited a lot from these efforts, and we think that Texas really has dealt with flooding in various ways, and some areas are further along than Houston, and David will talk about that a little bit later. But if you want to go ahead and go forward.
Yeah.
So the after Hurricane Harvey, part of that bipartisan budget act required the Corps to do a Buffalo Bayou and tributaries resiliency study. And you can see the watersheds involved in that study. That was released, an interim draft was released last year. And if you go forward to the next slide, the Corps' job is to find a way to safely convey all the waters from Addicks and Barker Reservoir downstream to the bay. That's really why those projects exist. Now, the problem for the Corps was that they did not buy that land or sufficient land to store all the water that came into Addicks and Barker. And because their plan was to put that water on land that was occupied by houses, that meant that the Corps, which had a plan and an intent to flood those houses, was liable to those upstream homeowners and business owners for the damage. And so the U.S. Court of Federal Claims has ruled that there is a taking, to use my lawyer jargon, and that the Corps is going to have to compensate those homeowners. And so this basically the total amount of damages is approximately between 11 and 15 billion dollars, or 7 and 15 billion dollars. It's a lot of money. And so we, rather than just cut them a check, there is an opportunity for the Corps to work with stakeholders to come up with a settlement that will provide funding that we're talking about. And if you go on to the next slide, we think that the Corps, when it released its interim study, basically used BCR, the benefit cost ratio, old school engineering to provide 8 alternatives. And one thing about that interim report is that it managed to unite our community. All of those organization logos that you saw during Chris's presentation, we really came together after the interim report. And in opposition to the interim report, nothing really galvanized the community like the Corps' plan, because it just did so much to harm what we hold dear. They wanted to channelize Buffalo Bayou, which really was very difficult, and but it was their preferred approach. And then also in their preferred approach was constructing a new reservoir on the Katy Prairie. And whether it was, the environmental groups, developer groups, engineering groups, all of us felt like these were the wrong ideas to pursue. And because of the opposition that Terry Hershey and George H.W. Bush lodged over 60 years ago, we were very surprised to see the Corps offer up what we saw as an old idea. And we also saw that the Katy Prairie would be compromised by this third reservoir. And again, this gave stakeholders an opportunity to really think about what these projects should be. And that's really where Houston Stronger came in and continues to play a role and trying to think through what should projects to protect Houston look like.
And Augie, I guess this is where I'm going to jump in because as Augie had mentioned, when the Corps came out with their study, the Buffalo Bayou and Tributaries Resiliency Study, it was successful in one thing, and that was that it made everybody mad. And so as a result of that, Houston Stronger got very active with coming up with an alternative to the Corps' approach. And that's really where I got involved. And we started trying to put a plan together. But the first thing we realized was that this was going to cost an enormous amount of money. And if we were going to advocate for spending this much money, we needed to have a clear idea of exactly what it was that we wanted to accomplish. And so we started with the idea of putting together some community goals. And that's what you see on the screen that we have in front here. And I'll let you read through that, but there's a couple of things that I do wanted to highlight with this. And the first is that we thought that it was important that any plan would be able to contain and convey the probable maximal event or 50 inches of rainfall. And that the combination of the reservoir capacity with any future downstream conveyance of that should be able to handle a storm event of that size. And then I'd also like to draw your attention to the last bullet that we have, which was any plan would have to have a tremendous amount of community support across all elements of the community. And there would have to be a diverse group of stakeholders that would be advocating for taking advantage of all the funding opportunities that were available because of the amount of money that we were talking about here. And then we had several other goals that were in mind here. The key of this, though, is that with these goals, we put together a plan that essentially consisted of 4 main components. And Chris, if we can go to the next slide, what you see here is a graphical representation of what those 4 components are. And obviously you see under the circle, the orange and white circles there, the Barker and Addicks Reservoir. You'll also see an orange line there moving from the reservoirs to the east, which represents a new conveyance pathway, which would be a plus or minus 40-foot flood tunnel. Then there is also in the upper Addicks Reservoir, additional retention and creekside storage that would need to be built. And then in the upper Cypress Creek Reservoir, there would be land protection, restoration, and shallow storage that would take advantage of the prairie's natural ability to attenuate floodwaters over a longer period of time. So this is a graphical representation of that. And if you'll see down there in the lower left-hand corner, this Buffalo Bayou Community Plan, we thought would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 billion to implement. Chris, can we go to the next slide? I had mentioned that there are 4 components to this plan. The most important part of component 1 is the construction of a plus or minus 40-foot diameter flood tunnel that would be capable of conveying approximately 15,000 CFS of floodwaters from Addicks and Barker reservoirs down to Galveston Bay. In addition, there would be interceptors along this flood route that would help to attenuate floodwaters from not only a large storm, but also from smaller storms, and would actually help the flooding conditions downstream of the reservoirs in Buffalo Bayou as a result of local rainstorms. And then finally, we contemplated that there would be an opportunity here to scout part of that water off via a force main to the City of Houston's East Water Purification Plant that would create a new source of water supply to the East Water Purification Plant. Next slide, Chris. The other thing that we wanted to advocate for here was as large a tunnel as possible. And essentially what this slide shows is how much economy of scale there is with each additional foot or each additional 10 foot of tunnel diameter that we're able to construct. And so obviously the tunnel cost per cubic foot of second conveyed in a 50-foot tunnel is half of the cost per cubic foot of second in a 30-foot diameter tunnel. And you'll see the various graphs here that we have that show under different head conditions and the amount of conveyance capacity that different diameters of tunnels from the reservoirs to the ship channel could convey. Next slide, please. This is then a plan and profile, a conceptual plan and profile view of the alignment of that tunnel and of the profile view of that tunnel, showing, demonstrating various intake structures along the alignment of that tunnel, which could help to alleviate flooding conditions downstream of Addicks and Barker Reservoir. You'll also see on the extreme right-hand side there, where we had contemplated graphically at least, scalping part of that water off into the East Water Purification Plant. Chris? The other thing I would like to mention before we move on from the tunnel concept is the issue of, is this even feasible? And there have been flood tunnels constructed in other cities throughout the Texas region. There's one that's in Dallas right now, that's under construction in Dallas right now. San Antonio has 2 storm tunnels. And so it's always kind of interesting that the city in Houston that has the most challenge with respect to flooding conditions is probably, is the last to address those flooding conditions via the use of flood tunnels. And again, here you've got pictorial representations of tunnels that are being built in other cities in the Texas region.
Sorry, I went too far.
That's fine. The second component is the additional excavation of the reservoirs, both Addicks and Barker. And we are proposing that there needs to be upwards of an additional 76,000 acre feet of compensating floodplain storage in each of those reservoirs for a total of what, 150, that's 152,000 acre feet that would be constructed in both reservoirs. Now, it raises the question of that's an enormous amount of dirt, and how do you deal with that dirt? And so we have come up with a plan to use that dredge material to create topography and to add ecological and recreational values to those reservoirs. And Chris, if you can go to the next slide. We've actually produced a plan here that shows how we can over excavate part of that reservoir to create water features, and then to dispose of that excavated dirt by building hills and other topographical features within the reservoir. So we would not be faced with the monumental challenge of disposing of that material off-site and the cost that would come with this. So we developed a plan here for Addicks Reservoir, and Chris, if you'll turn to the next, we've also developed a similar plan for Barker Reservoir. And then we can go to the next slide. Component 3 of our plan is to acquire land and to construct more storage in the Upper Addicks and Upper Cypress Creek reservoirs along the existing creeks that exist there. We would need to create somewhere upwards of an additional 25 to 30,000 acre feet of storage within the Upper Addicks Reservoir. And we think that that can be done through creekside retention and additional shallow retention in that upper Addicks watershed. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay.
And I will say that you'll notice that there's a little bit of a difference on this graphic. We've stolen this work or appropriated it with a lot of collaboration from the Katy Prairie Conservancy. And while David and the folks at BGE have done the brunt of our work, we certainly have been very fortunate in being able to collaborate and take work like this picture here from Katy Prairie Conservancy and others too. So, but David, please continue.
Yeah, and then the fourth component of the plan is to expand the ability of the prairie and the Upper Cypress Creek Reservoir through protection of those lands, through landowner agreements, and to create detention elements along Upper Cypress Creek to help attenuate floodwaters, because a lot of that water does make it down to the Addicks Reservoir. And so anything that we can attenuate in those floodwaters would help relieve pressure along Addicks Reservoir. The other point that I would like to make here is that by diverting water away from Buffalo Bayou and into the flood tunnel, we would help to attenuate the severe erosion and siltation issues that occur along Buffalo Bayou, and then eventually make it down into the Houston Chip Channel, where millions of dollars are spent every year on desiltation of that material that essentially makes it to the Houston Chip Channel from the erosion of Buffalo Bayou. And I think that this slide then talks a little bit more about the benefits of that tunnel with respect to its the improvement along Buffalo Bayou. And again, I think this again is talking about those siltation benefits. And I will like to add one more thing here is that the core study, which really called for the channelization of Buffalo Bayou, one of the things that really got Houston Stronger mobilized and looking at alternatives to this was that we really recognize that that is a non-starter. That solution was really a non-solution in our opinion, and would never be able to be implemented. The amount of opposition, community opposition that would result from a plan for the channelization of Buffalo Bayou has already been demonstrated. It was demonstrated in the 1950s and 60s. It's still demonstrated on a daily basis by the groups that meet on a regular basis to protect Buffalo Bayou as a natural resource. And I would like to add that of all the water courses within the state of Texas, Buffalo Bayou very well may be one of the most protected. And so the idea that it is going to be channelized and turned into a trapezoidal channel, a concrete line trapezoidal channel, just good luck to anybody who wants to try that. Next, Chris.
Okay.
And Auggie, I think you probably wanted to jump in here and talk about, we recognize that there were other challenges with the tunnel, specifically with the outlet structure going into the Houston Ship Channel with respect to navigation, with respect to turbulence and erosion potential. All of those would be engineering issues that obviously would need to be addressed through the preliminary engineering and the design of those facilities. We're not really addressing those here. We're just recognizing that they are issues that need to be addressed and are calling for them to be addressed.
Right, and those are engineering challenges that people should pay to solve. and I do appreciate all the volunteer time that David's put into this. But we have talked to the port industries, talk regularly with the flood control district and often with the Corps, and really about how the tunnel outlet can be, where it should be placed and how it can be constructed to really provide a benefit. And there are challenges, and we recognize that communities have opinions, and we want to make sure that the process that these different entities use is set up to channel those opinions into their thinking to make sure that once we get to construction, we're able to move this project forward, that we won't face significant opposition because we've included stakeholders in the process. And that's one of the things that Houston Stronger has worked hard to do, reach out across communities to be very inclusive in our approach and incomplete in our approach, and to a certain extent intentionally incomplete, because we understand that whether it's the flood control district, the Corps, the port, these entities have resources that they will want to use and should use to make sure that we have the best outcome, and that we should, as these entities use their resources, try to include stakeholders along the way, so we really do have an engineering solution that works for the community. And I think David has really been wonderful, and his team has done a good job of really looking at where we can include different alternatives to make sure we address issues, and then pointing those out to the Corps and to the flood control district, and really being a resource for those organizations as they try to move this project forward. And the tunnel is just one example. And David, did this is a BGE project?
Yes, actually, actually, I wouldn't say exclusively a BGE project, but it is one that we worked on, yes.
Yeah, and which is why I got into this presentation. David's, kind of flogging his own wares here. It's good work, though. Thank you. And then, back to the whole nature of our work at Houston Stronger, and that is really to continue to look at how this map is incomplete. Like I said, we are intentionally incomplete. We know what we know, and we understand we don't know everything. And we have a lot of intelligent engineers on this call. And if you have projects or ideas that should be included, I'll point back to Kevin Chanley and his work that we've included in our project. That was certainly a great improvement. BGE had done some really good initial estimates and preliminary engineering, and Kevin improved upon that. And that's been beneficial to our organization. And it's great for me just to be on a call with, David and Kevin Chanley and Larry Dunbar, and to hear these really smart engineers. And I'm a lawyer, so I think I told Ron, every JD comes with a complimentary PE, so I certainly think I know what they're talking about. But on the flip side of that, every PE comes with a complimentary JD. So when we get into legal issues, David and Kevin certainly have opinions, and it's fun for us to work through those. And it's fun just working on this project with David and Chris, and it's fun to be able to present it here today. And I'll flip it over to you, Chris.
I think we're pretty well finished, Auggie. This is just some general contact information. We do have HoustonStronger.net as a website. We'll be putting more up-to-date information on project costs relative to these plans that we were showing today. Certainly, we need to update it to include now the full the new number for the coastal spine. And then based on Kevin Shanley's work, we've got some adjustments to make on the reservoir excavation numbers as well. But we're somewhere close to about, I think it's up to about $72 to $74 billion on the regional plan, which is going to keep us all busy for a long time.
I thought you said 71 at the beginning of this call, so it seems like come back in a couple weeks to be up to 80 billion.
I'm not an engineer. You guys know that my math skills are quite limited, but I'll have to go back and do my additions again. But it's creeping up there. It's creeping up there.
And if you would like to sign up for our newsletter, it is info@HoustonStronger.net. That email is kind of a one-stop shop for the information that we're working So please shoot us an email with your ideas or if you'd like to know more.
Right. And my email address is simply Chris, CHRIS, @HoustonStronger.net. So either way you want to do it, happy to add you into our list.
So there's a question here from Dwayne Culp, and it says, how does the Houston Stronger project impact the design of the Houston coastal spine? 15,000 cubic feet per second is a lot of water pumping out somewhere to get water out of the spine system.
And I'll jump in here and answer that. Dwayne, I appreciate your question. The thing you need to recognize here is we're not talking about additional water going into the Houston Ship Channel and out into Galveston Bay. This is the same water that makes it down Buffalo Bayou now. We're just talking about diverting that water through a tunnel, through another conveyance method, but essentially the same water going to the same place.
Mm-hmm.
Just controlling how it gets there.
Mm-hmm. I don't know how to do that.
We do have time for more questions if anybody wants to reach out and put a question in the Q&A box. I don't see anything else popping in there. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and wrap this up. And if any questions pop in while I'm wrapping up, we have a few minutes to take that. So again, a very interesting presentation. I know as I told the folks yesterday, oh, here we go. Is this a new, here we go. We got some questions. At least I'm trying to find what in the chat box. I like the idea of diverting runoff for use as water sources. Or was this already answered? Has any thought been given to maximizing that idea, perhaps pumping it for use throughout West Harris County and maybe even out to San Antonio or West Texas?
Yes, and in the slides, we talk about running this to the city of Houston's East Water Purification Plant. And there are significant challenges related to that, or using stormwater, which it has a high variability for treated water, which, you know, your water treatment plants don't like a lot of variability. You want to minimize that. So, you know, but that certainly has been factored into our plan. And we have asked the city of Houston to look at that and give it some thought.
Auggie, it might be helpful if you kind of just let folks know kind of where we stand at the moment with this plan and with the Corps of Engineers.
Well, and that's where, I mean, it depends on which part of the project too. Inside Addicks and Barker Reservoir, we talked about excavation. There's actually a project that Willow Fork Drainage District has put in front of the Corps. And so they're getting a lease, it's called a lease back. And essentially what the Corps does is it will let, in this instance, the drainage district onto Corps land to construct an approved drainage project. And that's certainly, you know, a pared down version of what Kevin Chanley is talking about for all of Addicks and Barker. And this would just take place on the backside of Barker Reservoir and really be a test project. And that's the first part. The second part, the flood tunnel, is going through a study that's being supported in a couple of different ways. Harris County Flood Control District is completing phase 2 of its tunnel study. Phase 1 came out a while back, and that's where we got some of our cost estimates from for our flood tunnel. Phase 2 not only looks at the Buffalo Bayou flood tunnel, but 7 other tunnels in the Houston region, specifically Harris County, and will provide analysis and ranking on those projects along with cost estimates. And I see well, the other bit is the litigation, and I talked a little bit about the litigation in this project. Really, because of the litigation, some of the cost factors are, I mean, who's going to pay for it is a big open question. And we have been relatively explicit in thinking that the litigation can provide a significant portion of the funding for both excavation and the flood tunnel. There may be a need for local funding, and we've taken some guesses at what funding could and should be local and other sources of federal funding besides that litigation. But that's all speculative, and I won't speculate too much right now.
And then because the Corps of Engineers is continuing to work with Flood Control District on the tunnel study, and that they actually are considering that as part of the solution, I believe the Corps is applying for an extension of at least another 2 years before this whole plan could at least get to that point where they have a technical recommendation. Is that correct?
You're absolutely right, Chris, and thanks for bringing me back around on that, because the county's actually put in additional funding. They put up an additional 1.5 million, and that'll be matched with federal funds of 1.5 million for another 2-year study to really drill down just on the flood tunnel.
There are a couple of other questions that popped up here. One of them being is that, are there any other watersheds in the HGAC region that have similar issues as Buffalo Bayou? And the answer is yes, there are, and we have put together a plan to address those regional issues. Chris, can you put our regional plan back on the screen there?
I'll do that, sure. Let me see if I can go back. This one.
That's it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And a little hard to see at this scale, but I think we're sharing this presentation with everyone so you can see it. Thank you, Chris. And this goes out into, I guess, a 6-county region, showing monies that need to be spent to address flooding issues. And I think what we're looking at here is a number upwards of 67 billion to address the region's flooding concerns. And I think Chris, we started that number now has grown to a number in the neighborhood of 70 billion. The other question that I think came up is why don't we just implement the 1940s plan? And the challenge there is obviously the Houston region has grown, and that development has occurred in such a manner that there is not a corridor to implement that 1940s plan, which essentially called for the construction of the South Canal.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but I don't even know that there's enough money to buy up all the land, right? That would be needed.
Well, again, there has not been a corridor preserved.
Yeah, there's not a preserved corridor. And I guess this distance would actually be much longer than the distance that we've been proposing as well. But in concept, what we're trying to do is almost trying to take these different pieces of this 1940s plan, which did not get implemented, and see and just say, well, look, there were some good ideas back then. And even now, as we go forward, let's not lose the opportunity to take these ideas and go forward with them. People say, oh, that's too much money, we shouldn't do it. But look at the mess we're in. And if we had followed these plans earlier, what would things have looked like? And so we just have to not keep worrying about cost all the time, right? Because it costs even more in the long run when we don't follow through on these things. So that's
right. And recognize that the major component of the 1940s plan that was never put into place was the downstream conveyance from the reservoirs. And that's really one of the primary focuses of what we need to get in place.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, and just damages from Hurricane Harvey alone depending on the estimate that you're looking towards, are over $130 billion. So, and that's, you know, one storm. The San Antonio flood tunnel, they say, paid for itself in one storm event. So there's a really great return on investment story that goes along with this. And maybe we, you know, once we come back, we can talk a little more about that someday.
Like
Yeah.
one last question in there about, has future subsidence been taken into consideration?
And I think the answer is only to an extent, you know, and then I think this is really talking about looking at the current, you know, what existed on the ground when David studied it. I don't think that, and David, correct me if I'm wrong, we never asked David to say, all right, let's look at subsidence and the impact. But one thing I will say is, you know, regionally, subsidence has been diminished substantially in most parts of our region. There are some, you know, exceptions. Montgomery County, Jersey Village, and a few other areas still face some significant risks, but the subsidence is, you know, ground will shift in Houston, that's for sure. But I don't think, you know, David has kind of made sure that our project really is over-engineered is the wrong term, but, you know, I do think he's looked hard at making sure that we really are able to capture water and move it to avoid housing. So David, you want to follow up on that any?
Yeah, we did make some conservative assumptions, and probably the most helpful thing to talk from here would be the plan and profile drawing. Chris, if you can, you can get
Go
that
back
up
to
on
that
the
one.
screen.
Talking about the tunnel profile?
Yeah, the tunnel profile.
This one here.
Yeah, that's it. One of the things that you'll notice from this is that this does not function as a gravity drain tunnel, that it actually functions as a very large siphon. Oh,
Sorry about
there
that.
we go. You know, it's proposed to be approximately 100 feet deep. So the question is, since it's going to operate as a siphon, what kind of head conditions have we assumed? And the assumptions we made here is that there would be no flow in the tunnel until we got approximately 6 feet of storage within the reservoirs, and that the downstream head condition, the assumption we made was the Ike storm plus, I think it was 3 feet. It was either 2 or 3. I think it was the Ike storm plus 3 feet was the downstream head condition. And with that, we were able to get in a 40-foot tunnel, 15,000 CFS down the tunnel. So again, we've made some what we believe to be some pretty conservative assumptions to try and hit that 15,000 CFS number. With respect to the issue of subsidence over time, you know, as Auggie had mentioned, there's been a lot of gains made in retarding subsidence. Not to say that it would be completely halted over time, but we've got a lot of conservatism built into this model, so that for at least the foreseeable future, I don't think that it would be a major factor in reducing the capacity of the tunnel.
Good. Well, in the interest of getting everyone back to work on time, we are right at 1 o'clock. And to quote what Mr. Alba put in the chat box, this was a very good presentation and very timely information. I was going to say the same thing, but he said it for me. David, Auggie, Christina, I greatly appreciate you all taking the time to speak with us today. Again, this is on everybody's mind. This is critical to everyone in this area. So goes Houston, so goes Texas, so goes the United States, basically. So
And if I could make one more.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Again, if you get on our distribution list right now, we're still doing our meetings virtually. And there's no cost to charge. There's no charge to be just on the mailing list and participate in that event. But also, if you are with another organization that you think would be interested in joining us, we'd love to have them too. And mostly what we're interested in is being able to build our consensus and to get more people involved who have an understanding and want to make a change. So we'd be interested to know that information as well. But it costs nothing to get on our distribution list or to attend future meetings if you'd like to. Thank you.
Fantastic. I would assume you're going to have some folks taking you up on that. Again, thank you all. We greatly appreciate